What is the impact of wars on economies? This question was brilliantly answered by two economists by the names of Miguel and Roland in their paper, The Long-Run Impact of Bombing Vietnam. So, it basically tries to look at how wars, and specifically a bombing campaign, impacted the long-run success of an economy when looking at micro and macro factors. So, did the massive scale of bombing, which it was a massive scale because there were 3 times more bombs dropped on Vietnam than the whole of World War II. So it was the largest bombing campaign in the history of the world, the history of any civilization. And so basically it looks at how this massive campaign that was extremely disruptive, with even other things other than bombs like napalm being dropped on countrysides and villages. And it looked at how that impacted the long-run capabilities of the Vietnamese economy. So, really brilliant question. And you would kind of think, you sit back and you go, well, wars have impacts on the macroeconomy when looking at, there'll be less trade, less investment, less income per capita growth. All these things would be stipend and would impact the future capabilities of an economy. It also has impacts on micro, factors like, education will be reduced while schooling. There's factors on, social welfare, there's impacts on healthcare systems and all these types of things. So when looking at wars, you really assume that, and you'd really theorize that they have negative impacts on economies, especially if bombing's involved, where it destroys massive human and physical capital. So the two economists, sort of took this all into account and try to think, okay, how do we test this? And there's a couple hurdles that you have to get over when looking at wars, and specifically civil wars. So let's get into that. Before you try to go estimate the causal effects of a variable on another variable, it's really important to understand the context and understand the things that might impact your estimation strategy. And the first thing to do specifically when looking at wars is to try to have a brief understanding about the complexity of war. We're not historians here or history buffs or war buffs. We're just economists trying to understand a relationship. So you don't have to be super in detail. But I want to just quickly cover why the war started and how it started and things that could impact it. So after World War II, and after the Japanese occupation of Vietnam was eluded, France came back in to find a Vietnamese country not wanting to be a subject of colonialism anymore. So this started the First Indochina War, which kind of ended in the country being split in two. And after much deliberation and, sparks of civil war and political impacts and stuff like that, the Second Indochina War started, and this is more commonly known as the Vietnamese War. And this basically was, as most people know, a kind of proxy war from capitalism to communism, with the Northern Viet Cong, or Democratic Republic of Vietnam, backed by China and Russia, versus the Republic of Vietnam in the South, backed by Western powers like the US specifically. And after kind of, tensions rising and help being sent by the US, they finally fully committed to sending troops in 1965. And this is when our bombing campaign and our data collection starts. So now that we know kind of a brief overall history of the Vietnamese War, we can try to look at what are things that could impact and what are, tricky challenges that we have to overcome to gain a brilliant and solid estimation strategy. And the first thing to look at is reverse causality. So this basically is when you're looking at, poverty and income, the relationship goes both ways. So basically, having a poverty and reduced income state would more likely lead to a civil war, but also having a civil war would more likely lead to a poverty and income-ridden state. There's also a massive thing on omitted variable bias. Basically, in our trio of variables, from weak states to poverty to civil war, there's an omitted variable bias from weak states to civil war. And so these two things are massive things that you have to really try consider when trying to find an estimation strategy. And the final thing, and specific to this paper, is the non-random effects of bombing. So when we think of bombing and, wars, Air forces don't just drop bombs on random areas. They have targets, they have reasons, and this basically makes our X variable, the bombing of Vietnam, non-random. And this leads us into our empirical strategy. So, like always, and I've just realized that it's the past 3 videos I've done, have all the trio of Holy Trinity of econometric methods. We'll start with my favorite, instrumental variables, which if you watch the last videos, you'll kind of know a bit about. But basically, it's if your X variable is non-random. In this case, the bombing was not random. And you have to find a variable that explains your non-random X. And in this case, they used the 17th parallel. So the 17th parallel was the decided border between the north and south of Vietnam. And this was where most of the fighting took place. And also this is where most of the bombing took place. The closer to the 17th parallel, the more bombs dropped. So they used that and the proximity of the bombs dropped to the 17th parallel as an instrumental variable for the amount of bombs dropped. Then they used fixed effects and control variables to kind of complete the overall strategy, giving us this equation. So they've got this equation and they're trying to look at the long run economic predictors and economic variables of Vietnam and based on how much bombing took place in said area. So let's move on to the results. First of all, let's look at the instrument proximity to the 17th parallel for the predicted bombing intensity was correct. So just going to shove up table 3, and if you look in the corner, it shows it's significant. So this is great because if our instrument is not significant and isn't viable in this situation, it basically means you can't use it and the rest of your identification strategy is just out the window. So it kind of destroys your whole paper, but not the case here. So now that we know our estimation strategy works, let's look at the impact of bombing on macro things down the line. So the first one is table 4, I'll just shove it up, and it analyzes the local bombing impacts on the estimated 1999 poverty rate. So 25 years down the line, approximately. And it tries to see if there's an impact of the bombing on the amount of poverty that is experienced in the bombed areas of Vietnam. And if you look in the top right corner, it shows that there's no significant effects, and even if they were significant, they're tiny, so 0.00026. So super small effects, and this shows that the amount of bombing that took place in the area in Vietnam did not have an impact on the poverty of the area later down the line. So really interesting, and we're going to talk about why that might be the case. But now let's just quickly jump on to the impacts on physical infrastructure and human capital in table 7. So this basically shows that there are also no effects on the physical and human capital of Vietnam based on the amount of bombing, which is really surprising, but it leads us to why we didn't find results in the first place. And the main theory of why there weren't any long-run effects of the bombing campaign of Vietnam on the Vietnamese economy is because the bombing took place in rural areas. So if you know a bit about the 17th parallel, and at the time it was the frontier of the war where most of the fighting took place, but it was also a rural jungle area. And so basically the bombing of that type of area doesn't have massive effects because the infrastructure it's destroying, if any, is quite easily replaceable because it's quite, it's wooden or it's, hand constructed, where basically it was quite easy for them to just rebuild it quite quickly. So that's one theory why we didn't really see any effects 25 years down the line. The other is to do with the institutions, because institutions really do matter. And basically post the war, when it was concluded, the Vietnamese government had massive reconstruction efforts made into the bombed areas, and also massive schooling infrastructure and schooling participation campaigns in rural areas to try to bring everybody out of poverty. And this could have impacted down the line the poverty rates in the places, because now they have better infrastructure and the generation that has recently grown up is more educated than the one before, leading to less poverty. So now we've got kind of two cases why it might also be the case, but there's one which isn't super duper mentioned in the paper, but it's kind of my favorite one, and it's the mum we have X at home vibes, which basically is when you're a country and you're looking at upgrading your infrastructure, there's always a hurdle of you already have infrastructure that is the same. Maybe it's less efficient. So a good example is a country looking at upgrading their railway system to high-speed railway. It's definitely more efficient, but if you've already got a decently modernized railway system, there's not much of a, incentive to upgrade, because it's a lot of money extra for a small gain. But if you are having a war or you have a natural disaster that completely wipes it out, that little bit of extra spending on top of it is, valid for the efficiency gain. So you might as well, upgrade to the newest and best. And so that's why in countries after, massive bombing campaigns, really destructive bombs or natural disasters, they can sometimes bounce back stronger because they don't have an excuse not to implement the most effective new technology and infrastructure. So really, really cool. And there are kind of a couple arguments brought up against this paper, mentioned in the paper and also just in general. And it's kind of looking at why we don't see these effects, and maybe there are effects, we just don't see them. And the first one is, we don't really know how the Vietnamese economy would have fared in the absence of war. Maybe there would have been extremely, higher rates of poverty reduction and income, growth and capital accumulation. Maybe all these effects were damaged by war, but they were so big to start with that they remained positive. So that's a really interesting thing, and that's the problem with, economics, is you can never know. Not everything will be the same. You don't know the outcome without the war. So the next kind of thing is, on the similar line where it's, we don't really have a best indicator because of selection bias. And this basically means, because the Vietnamese economy, kind of bounced back because potentially the war wasn't as severe, there's a selection bias because now that data is available. That country's in a good enough place after the war to collect data. Whereas if they weren't in a brilliant place after, a civil war, for instance, like Somalia, you don't have as readily available data. So the cases you can study are only the positive effects of war in kind of terms. But the cases where you don't have data and can't do a study might be the cases that they're negative effects of war. So you are kind of having this massive selection bias when analyzing the effects of war, which you really can't get around. And also, there's a big thing on, maybe there aren't economic effects, but looking at macroeconomic effects, but there's definitely effects when looking at microeconomic effects, when looking at, people. So there was lots of studies done into the mental health of survivors of the Vietnam War when they were children during the war. And there were massive, rates of mental health issues and depression for those growing up during the war. And also there's just lots of other micro effects that weren't measured in the study. And finally, there's the fact that the Vietnamese War and the War of Vietnam wasn't the last war the Vietnamese government went into. So in 1979, they went into a war with China. And so these are things that you can't, there might have been more growth or there might have been less growth without this war. You just really, don't know. But in total, really brilliant paper. Kind of shows, limited effects of a bombing campaign that was massive. And, just a really good strategy of thinking how to use a natural experiment in history to understand economic consequences of war. So if you enjoy the paper, I really recommend reading it. It's quite an easy read. It's not really, really complex. And check out the other videos on the page. Hopefully you'll enjoy them too if you enjoyed this one. And thank you for getting all the way to the end of the video. See ya. Have a good day.